Morning.
Good morning, everybody. I would ask those of you who are still standing, Vasil and Andrew, please take your seats. Thank you all for joining us today for this discussion, which EPC is delighted to be hosting with Ukrainian Prism. It's always a pleasure to work with the colleagues from there. The topic of today's discussion is very timely and it's very important. Peace in Ukraine as the foundation for the continent's security architecture, the role of Europe at the negotiating table. Obviously, Europe doesn't actually have a seat at the negotiating table yet. One can hope that it will have a seat there eventually. And of course, that's one of the points that we are going to be talking about today. I mean, taking stock of the current situation, both on the ground in Ukraine, about what's going on in terms of the negotiations that are ongoing between Washington and Russia, and Washington and the Ukrainians. I mean, the most recent round took place yesterday in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Again, I'm guessing many of you saw the statements that were put out by the Americans, and then a statement by the Russians. Let's say they weren't fully aligned with each other, but however you read it, it's a particularly concerning situation. I mean, first and foremost for Ukraine, which has been sidelined almost fully by the Americans in favor of President Trump's ongoing bromance and his asphyxiation with President Putin, but also for Europe, because Europe is also sidelined at the moment. So Europe needs to find a way to make itself relevant and to have a seat at that table, but also to speed up the efforts to support Ukraine. I mean, there's many conversations going on about coalitions of the willing that have been going on for months. There's many different European politicians trying to lead on different things. But what's missing so far is actually concrete vision, concrete results. So I hope that we're going to dive into this today and find some of these concrete steps that can be taken, and taken very soon, because the clock is ticking. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and I'm going to give the floor to my colleague Hennadiy from Ukrainian Prism. But we are joined today by a really stellar panel of experts who know this topic very well. Sabine Fischer, Senior Fellow at the SWP, who leads the work on Russia and the region for many years. It's always a big pleasure to have you here, Sabine. Oleksandr Sushko, Executive Director of the International Renaissance Foundation, who has come from Kiev, so an old friend as well, and a long-term expert on these issues. So welcome to you, Oleksandr. Yulia Soldatiuk-Westerveld, Senior Research Fellow, EU and Global Affairs Unit at Clingendael Institute, who is also working extensively on these issues as we speak. And last but not least, Klara Lindström, Analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Again, somebody who's deeply engaged in this topic. I think everybody here is looking for solutions to these questions, an end to the war and for a just and sustainable peace for Ukraine. But I want to give the floor first to you, Hennadiy, so there you go.
Dear friends, colleagues, a very good morning from my side. It's always a pleasure to co-partner events with European Policy Center and with Amanda's team. So we are privileged and we appreciate this possibility. But I think that this timely event is also indicative because we have a big consortium of partners organizing this event. We have also Open Society Foundations, which is our crucial strategic partner. We have Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. And also we have backing from our mission, Ukrainian mission to European Union. That means that we have a big intersectoral coalition, which means that issue we are trying to tackle today is quite of importance. Let me mention that Ukraine and European Union has an extensive track when it comes to support and even on possible peace arrangements. We cooperated extensively last year, and European Union was very instrumental in shaping the agenda and shaping the participation in global summit on peace in Ukraine in Switzerland. But now the situation has changed, and we know that now we have to revisit our partners and to find where do we have a common denominator. With this, I think that Ukraine still has deep trust and confidence in European Union, and basically it's indicated in our Ukrainian recent steps we have taken. For example, if you look into the joint statement after Jeddah's meeting on 11th of March, you will see that Ukraine stated that we see Europe should be at the negotiation table, should be involved in this process. And on 15th of March, there was a decision of President Zelensky, who created a Ukrainian delegation for negotiations with partners on just peace. I think that is indicative that we have reliance, and we have also expectations from our partners in European capitals and from Brussels as well. So I think it would be good for us to listen from our, as Amanda rightly pointed out, stellar panel today. What are the possibilities on political level, on level of instruments? So with this, I wish our fruitful discussion, and let me iterate, it was a pleasure to have a partnership with EPC.
Thank you, Hennadiy. And with that, I'm going to give the floor straight to you, Sabine, because we have a very limited amount of time. So there you go.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming and for your interest in this really absolutely essential topic also for Europe. Since I'm the first speaker on the list, I thought I set the stage a little bit and then we can dig deeper in the course of the discussion. So I wanted to start with a brief analysis of what happened since the inauguration of the Trump administration, because I think that what actually happened is that Trump has kicked over the chessboard. We are in a completely new situation. And by his actions, the Trump administration has created a situation of extreme asymmetry between Russia and Ukraine. And I think it is very important for us to remember that this asymmetry does not reflect the balance of power on the battlefield that we see today. So the change that is happening from the international level. It has nothing to do with the war, the actual war, and the course of the war over the past 3 years. So what the Trump administration has been doing, it has adopted Russian propaganda narratives about the origins of the war. It accepts Russian claims on Ukrainian territories. It supports Russian demands for elections in Ukraine, which is, okay, I'm not going to talk. I mean, it's unbelievable. And of course, it pressurizes Ukraine to accept these demands. So the process that the Trump administration has started and that is unfolding as we speak, to my mind, is not about conflict resolution in Russia's war against Ukraine. It is actually about normalization of relations, US relations with Russia, and about squashing one side of the conflict, and that is Ukraine, and by extension, Europe, into submission. So it's a very dangerous situation. Russia is using this in a very skillful way, unfortunately, and is extracting concessions on every step of the process. And I think the outcome of the talks in Saudi Arabia yesterday and today, and the way the Russian side is playing them, is a very good example for this strategy. So in these conditions, I have huge doubts. I actually don't believe that this is a process that can lead in any way to a durable ceasefire, let alone comprehensive, just and sustainable peace for Ukraine. So I think this is really out of the question in the current situation. Trump has also put his own administration not in a position of strength, because the US administration loves to talk about peace through strength. What actually happened is that he, from the first day of his administration, he has been giving away leverage over Russia. So he has put his own administration into a very weak negotiation position. Now we're supposed to talk about the place and the role for Europe in this situation. And to my mind, the only place and role that Europe can take and should take in this situation is support for Ukraine. And this means support for Ukraine against Russia, and now also against the United States. Just a few words about what needs to be done in this situation. I think everything has to start from the military dimension. Without the military dimension, I think there is absolutely no chance to succeed with anything else. So Europe has to ramp up its support for Ukraine, military support for Ukraine, and its own deterrence capabilities. Without that, nothing else will work. I mean, you all know we are in Brussels, so you're all following also the European debates. A lot is happening at the rhetorical level, at the programmatic level, at the level of actual deeds. We're still lagging behind, and this is a huge problem. So this is what everything needs to start from. The second point I would like to make here is that I think that Europe has, together with Ukraine, has to define acceptable ceasefire conditions, because I think we cannot ignore the fact that we're now talking about ceasefire options. So there needs to be a clear position of Ukraine together with Europe about acceptable ceasefire terms and red lines, and in the areas of scope and modalities of cessation of hostilities, mechanisms for supervision, monitoring, verification, and also enforcement. There also need to be joint positions, approaches, and red lines for broader political issues. And here I would like to mention the size and the strength of Ukrainian armed forces, Ukraine's internal and external sovereignty, elections in Ukraine. I mentioned that at the beginning. I think it's a very crucial point. Non-recognition of any annexations over the past 11 years. There needs to be an approach towards occupation also, accountability, etc., etc. And of course, Europe has to take a very strong position regarding the sanctions, because this will be something that the Trump administration will keep bringing up and probably withdraw from the sanctions regime. So this will be a very, very difficult situation to navigate for the European Union. But I think sanctions will be absolutely key in the coming months. The peace formula, because this is something that was also in the questions that we got for the panel, Ukraine's peace formula, I think, remains important as Ukraine's legitimate position and also end goal, and it will remain as an important orientation for the positions that need to be formulated now. Now, all this, as I said before, needs to be put up against, on the one hand, Russia's maximalist demands and conditions, its demands for Ukrainian capitulation, actually, and also against Washington's new policy. And here, I think the main goal has to be to slow down the process, to really slow down the process and to advocate complexity. Because the approach that the American administration has taken is not about complexity. It's about quick deals, probably dirty deals, and especially deals that are not advantageous for Ukraine. So to wrap this up, I think Ukraine and Europe are in a two-front situation now. Can no longer rely on the US as a reliable partner, and this is very dangerous for both of them. So they are in this, we are in this together. Are we ready for that? As I said, I mean, I see a lot of movement now, particularly on the defense side of things. Personally, I have to say, I think it's shameful that after 3 years of full-scale invasion, it needed the Munich speech by J.D. Vance and the debacle in the Oval Office on 28th of February to kick us out of our comfort zone. And I mean, not all of us, of course. There are European member states and NATO member states who have been advocating a tougher policy for a very long time. But many European countries were still in this comfort zone, even after the Trump inauguration. So we're very far behind, and we're not really in a good place. And we need to act very, very fast now in order to rescue the situation. I think I will leave it there because we don't have much time, and there are many other excellent speakers on the panel, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just a quick follow-up question. I mean, what do you see? I mean, what is Trump expecting to get out of this approach with the Russians? I mean, what is his? It's very unclear to me, to be frank.
Yeah. So I think nobody knows. Maybe Trump doesn't know himself. I think there are motives on different levels. I think there is the ego level, which is important. So I think Trump wants to have this image as and wants to boost his image as a deal maker and peace broker. That's one thing. I think another aspect of this whole process is, and this is something that really is cross-cutting, it's a hyper-fast personalization of US policy. It's a huge problem, not only with regard to the war against Ukraine, but really across the board. Then there are several potential geopolitical motives. The reverse Kissinger is something that keeps being mentioned. And also, I mean, there are people in the Trump administration who seriously believe that US engagement in Europe and especially Ukraine and also in the Middle East is a burden and needs to be reduced. But I don't think if this is really what drives Trump. I'm really not sure. So I think it may be a mix of all these factors. And I mean, I said that he actually put himself in a very weak position vis-a-vis Putin. And this has two reasons. I mean, he he gave away a lot of leverage, but that's not all. I think the Russians have a very specific perspective of the situation right now. And this perspective is very, very different from 2016-17. Because now I think the US administration is basically transforming itself into a tool of Russian policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, but also vis-a-vis Europe. That's one thing, and they're using this. But at the same time, and if you followed the Russian discourse over the past 10 years, you could see that evolving. Russia sees itself, the Putin regime sees itself in a post-Western multipolar world. And Trump is one of the main destructors of the Western world. This is the other, so to speak, important function that they ascribe to Trump. So this is not about partnership. This is about leaving the Western world behind for good and constructing this new world order that they actually want to have. And I don't think that this is appreciated and understood in Washington.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I now want to turn to you, Oleksandr, to get the take from Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has been put in a very difficult situation by President Trump and started off very badly. I mean, they spent the 3 years of insufficient or quick military support from the Biden administration and are now in a very difficult situation vis-a-vis Trump, almost having to just go along with everything that Trump puts on the table or says, well, this is how it looks like. So it'd be good to get your take and also how you view the current approach by European partners and others, and what more can be done from that side and how quickly.
Thank you, Amanda. First of all, I would like to appreciate your interest and your European Policy Center as a think tank doing very constant, very high quality work on Ukraine, on EU approach to the war, to the EU enlargement, all the things which are of high importance for our country. And I also appreciate Ukrainian Prism here, which the Ukrainian think tanks, which is doing constantly in bringing Ukrainian voices here to the EU institutions and beyond. And for our foundation, this is a big pleasure, and it's highly important for us to be a part of this dialogue. And so, thank you for inviting me. For me, it's just the visit after quite long break. So I appreciate it as my return to this stage, and I'm happy to see many familiar faces, but also lots of new faces here in the audience, and I hope to have a productive debate. So yes, for this period of time, paradoxically, the term peace, the whole narrative around peace is dominating the debate regarding the Russian war on Ukraine. And it would be nice, certainly, because everyone in Ukraine wants peace. But paradox here is that we are not likely to be closer to the real peace than we were a year ago. But we have lots of discussions with lots of political debates, but practically, in practical terms, thinking seriously, there are at least not real preconditions met to see that we are closer to peace now. And there are some illusions. And yes, you mentioned Trump inauguration as a greatest change-making event this year. And that was exactly the Trump's narrative on peace, which entered the audience. And I really believe that Trump is a person who wants this peace. This is his ambition. He promised that. This is about his political image to follow this direction. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the methods and approach and the practical work which Trump administration is doing is not likely to bring us to the just and sustainable peace as the way how we want it. Certainly, there are some diplomatic efforts. But I absolutely agree with Sabine and with the others that this approach, which makes America weaker vis-a-vis Russia, and this is exactly this way, is not give us a lot of hope for the fast peace. And now we see from the very recent weeks how negotiations are going on, that Russia is just trying to exploit Trump's illusions in order to strengthen their position, in order to make their wish list a real political program. Because what we now see is that step by step, they try to use weakness of the United States in order to constitute their wish list as a main negotiating program. Yeah. So, and here, yes, as we already mentioned, the territorial integrity of Ukraine already has been questioned by the US officials, but also there is a readiness of the United States to negotiate issues which are certainly the red lines for Ukraine. That is why I do not see the real reason to expect that this effort by Trump will succeed. The only question to me is, who will be finally blamed for the failure? Because the Russian strategy, why they are not ignoring the elections, they are formally in favor of elections, the negotiations. They are entering. They do not deny negotiations, and they will continue to take part. Why? Because they need their image of the side of the war which is seeking for peace. This is important for them in order to be credible and legitimate, in order to come back to the high stage of global politics, in order to translate it to the lots of neutral forces across the globe to say that we are in favor of peace. But in fact, Putin is not looking for peace because he believes that time is on his side. The only situation when Putin may look for a real end game of the war is if he believes that time is running and the continuation of the war will bring them into more difficult position than it is now. The dynamics is not on his side. But now it's different. So he believes that as long he continue fighting, the situation is better and better for him. And the changes in the United States are remarkable proof of this. So he says, if it's happened with the United States, it may happen everywhere, and no one can prevent. We can be strong, even stronger position now. The tactics is to take part in the negotiations without any real progress. Yeah. And finally, using any available opportunity in order to accuse Ukraine if something goes wrong, if Ukraine, for example, refuses to accept Russian wish list as a compromise, they will try to accuse Ukraine in blocking peace deal. And unfortunately, we don't know which side will be taken by Trump administration, but likely they will also blame Ukraine at certain point. And so this is the main strategy of Russia in this process. Certainly I'm not in a position to discuss either Putin is right in his expectation that time is on his side. Who knows? Yeah. But This is overwhelming opinion inside the Russian elite, that sooner or later they will get everything. So that is why they will not try to stop the war now, getting something. I think that even they bring their wish list, and we know that it is actively discussed in the negotiations just a few days ago in Saudi Arabia. So this is not just talks about Black Sea, not just talks about the energy infrastructure, but it also the whole complexity is being debated. And here we probably have to say that we feel at risk of the ignorance and very basic precondition of just and sustainable peace. And here probably I will just have to remind or to formulate how I see so-called red lines on Ukrainian side. We understand that hypothetically there will be a need to some compromise if Putin really is ready for that. But here at this particular moment, for example, Putin requires legitimization of his annexation. So it's not just about the control of the territory. It is not enough for him. He wants Ukraine and the world to acknowledge these territories which are occupied as Russian legitimate territories, which certainly is not acceptable. No Ukrainian government, no Ukrainian president will ever sign such an agreement which acknowledges Russian annexation as a legitimate one. And this is clear. What Ukraine can do under certain conditions is to accept that at this moment it is not possible to regain this territory by military means, and then there will be a policy of occupation, occupied territories. That it may be this way. But certainly Russia is seeking something different. You also know that Russia also wants to control some territories which are currently not under Russian control. They are willing to occupy more territories. They claim they are constitutional territories, including big cities like Zaporizhia and Kherson. And they do not want to even seriously consider stopping the battle without controlling these big cities. And also, this is also not appropriate. Then the issue of justice. To what extent justice may be disconnected from peace? I think this is one of the most difficult issues. And here, the role of the civil society of Ukraine is significant in the sense that civil society has invested a lot of efforts in order to document the war crimes, to fix the situation, and to bring voices of victims to be heard across the globe. And here I cannot imagine that these groups, these people who have done so much to make Russian war crimes visible for the world will accept that there will be no way to justice for the victims. That's a huge challenge. Either we will have peace versus justice, or it will come together. That's one of the biggest challenges to any peace solution we have. And for Ukraine, probably there will be one of the, again, red lines, not to accept that there will be no justice at all. Then the issue of limitation of Ukrainian sovereignty, limitation of Ukrainian defense capacity, which is also among the top on Russian wish list. Here we know that Russia demands Ukrainian armed forces to be limited to, say, either from 70 to 100,000, which is very symbolic in the sense that Russia, military capacity Russia has. they also want to put a severe limitation on Ukrainian defense industry capacity for the future, for any peace settlement. And one more thing, that Russian concept of neutrality, which they want to impose on Ukraine. This is not only about NATO accession or non-accession to NATO. This is more about the capacity of Ukraine to have international cooperation in the field of security, defense production, and defense development. So under Russian scheme of full neutrality, they mean that Ukraine will withdraw from any international cooperation on armed trade, security, trainings, whatever. That's significantly limit Ukrainian chance to survive in the future. So these are the things where the positions of Kremlin and Ukraine are so far away that I cannot imagine that in the foreseeable future the consensus may be found. That is why unfortunately I'm skeptical about the chance to get negotiated peace in the near months, say. So then we have to be prepared that this story of war will probably not be over this year. And then the issue of sometime people ask me either Ukrainian civil society wants to continue war till the last Ukrainian, like people from Trump administrations sometimes ask us. And this is certainly not the case. Certainly, if we may find the solution, we would be in favor of this. But I started with my prognosis that Putin will end the war, will look for the peace seriously only when he believes the time is not on his side. So what we can do is to bring this moment closer for Putin or somebody who is in charge of Russia to understand that time is no longer on their side. They have no chance to win in the strategic perspective. And then there will be a chance for peace. And this is what we can do together with, if Europe is united, if Europe is taking significant step in order to bring its voice, its message that Europe's commitments is serious, that in the end, finally, Ukraine will be inside European perimeter of security, not in the gray zone. So this is a message which should be expressed explicitly, and Russia should hear this. So Ukraine is a part of European security perimeter and not in the gray zone. So this is I will stop with this. Thank you, and I will ready to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Oleksandr. I mean, it seems to me that Russia is implementing a strategy that it's implemented many times in the past. I mean, it's using the same old playbook and expecting the same end result. I mean, including the inability of the Europeans and others to stand up to the Kremlin. But what you said about the occupied territories, it reminded me of this terrible statement that J.D. Vance made a couple of days ago. I think he was talking about Zaporizhia, where he said, look, they had a referendum and everybody voted to be part of Russia. So there we are. As if, I mean, this is terrible, huh? And again, straight out of, I mean, that is straight out of Russia's playbook as well, right? They're replicating Russian disinformation and storytelling. But you mentioned Europe at the end, the EU. So we now want to come to that part. So I want to start with you, Julia, for you to give us your insights on what tools the EU has. I mean, the EU's approach so far, or Europe, I should say, as a continent, and what more can be done now, and how important is it that these things are done now?
Thank you, and good to be here. I will not repeat the very good points and arguments made by my previous speakers, but just really shortly reflect on 2 points that were made. To start with, administration of Trump and 3 goals what is administration of Trump doing at the moment. So they are playing a short game. That's their strategic kind of approach, objective, and they want to achieve an end of fighting or a war termination or a peace agreement in between Russia and Ukraine. They are looking into normalizing the political relations with Russia, and they're also exploring opportunities for economic cooperation, technological cooperation. And the interesting thing is that they do not do it in sequence, they do it at the same time. So this is really confusing for the European partners. And then we have Russian kind of strategic approach to this. They are playing a long game. And the long game, and Oleksandr talked about it extensively, I just want to say, to add to that, that the war of attrition and who will fall first, Russia or Ukraine. This is basically the play that is there, and in that sense, the time is on the side of Russia as long as Europe and Ukraine are not cooperating in strengthening their common defense and resilience. As it is on the side of Ukraine and Europe if they will start working on that, right? Because we see already Rearm Europe initiative and the white paper on defense. There are different plans or ideas being circulated around and being discussed. And according to predictions, in order to realize if the financing will be there, in order to finalize to work on these plans, we need at least 4 years. So that's a time EU needs in order to ramp up its own defense. And yeah, so just to add on that, it seems now in the current situation that the strategic objectives of the European Union are closer to Ukrainian strategic objectives and farther away from the American. So it makes sense to collaborate on that point. And Ukraine is increasingly becoming a contributor to European security instead of only consumer. So that's also something to a trend that is developing itself. On a specific aspect, so there are some certain things the European Union can do and things that EU member states are better in. So the issue of sanctions, for example, the increasing and maintaining the pressure on Russia on sanctions, that is something can be done on the European level. The political statements, the political support for certain decisions within the European Union, but also in support of Ukraine, this is also something to be done on the is more effective on the European level, as well as mobilizing the financing instruments for increasing defense spending and ramping up defense industry, whether it is through a joint borrowing facility, European bonds, or any other, and converting loans into grants for the European member states. But another very important instrument, and I think it's important to divide, to distinguish between the immediate urgent actions that are needed, midterm and long term, and some of them are also very important on the long term, and that's EU integration and enlargement and Ukraine's EU integration process. It should not be underestimated in this process of peace negotiations, because once there is a predictable and long-term commitment has been established to integrate Ukraine in the European plans on clean industrial deals or green deals, integrated in a European energy transition framework and other sectors, that's a given. That's a given that is being included then as in Ukraine's position in the negotiation, and will strengthen Ukraine's position in negotiation. So those steps are very important. And then, of course, European Union is not meant as a defense union, and that's where the coalition of the willing, the initiatives of separate member states come in. And it's also important because there is no, they don't have this burden of joint decision-making process, right? And veto power to stumble how to say push back on any decision. So that is also much more quicker and effective on that sense. And I guess to add a different aspect to the conversation we are having, just where do we stand in a peace negotiation process at the moment? So there are some we hear some. There's no one definition about how the peace negotiation process should go. Different countries have different formats and settings from what we see in history. But one very important aspect is that comprehensive, true peace negotiations can only start when both countries involved in a war are willing to sit at the table and negotiate, and they think they appreciate, they believe that the diplomatic negotiation is more fruitful for them, for their strategic interest than fighting. And in that context, a ceasefire is merely, it's not an end of fighting. This is merely a break that is enforced in order to give the political leaders space to structure those negotiations, and we are not seeing this at the moment, right? We see these discussions in Jeddah and between a phone call between Trump and Putin, the agreement to the moratorium on the Black Sea. If you really look into who is benefiting more from that, Russia and Ukraine, you see that everything Russia has agreed to is very much in its strategic interest. So coming back to the role of the EU and instruments, there are so many existing instruments that can be enforced and are being enforced, and European External Action Service is working on that to increase the efficiency of sanctions, of CSDP missions, of initiatives such as Rearm Europe or any other in that connected to that. But it is also important to explain this difference that we discussed in the perceptions in the context, what is actually going on between Russia and Ukraine to the United States. And separate with certain EU leaders of the presidents of the member states are much better positioned and have the ear of Trump to bring these messages and to basically advocate for the interest on Ukraine. They're better positioned, and I think this is also a very important role, the communication aspect. Right, so I think I will stop here and open the floor for.
Thank you very much, Julia. I want to stay on the role of the EU and come to you, Klara, and then we can take questions from the floor, sort of continuing along the lines that Julia has been talked about. I mean, President Zelensky has been quite clear that Ukraine expects Europeans or coalitions of the willing to do much more. He's also been quite clear about the need to have a European force or a coalition of the willing force on the ground in Ukraine. I mean, he's mentioned that several times, and there have been many discussions over the last week, some of them in France, some of them in the UK. I mean, it seems to go backwards and forwards, but what's been the conclusion of all those discussions actually still remains to be seen, because they say we've met, we've talked, we're going to meet again. So I would like to hear your insights on where this discussion's going. Is there likely to be anything agreed anytime soon? It's not a new thing, the coalition of the willing. It's been around for a while. Who could be in it? Who would be ready? And what would be the actual consequences if they actually aren't able to put together the sort of, whatever you want to call it, reassurance, deterrence, it doesn't matter what you call it, because at the end of the day, they may decide not to do it because the Russians don't like it. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, as the first remark, whether the Russians like it or not is not the relevant question to ask in this context. And thank you for the questions. I will speak both from the EU and also the European perspective. And mind you, those can be different. And this is something that I say as someone who has lived for a number of years in the UK as well. I would start off maybe by noting three shocks that has happened for the EU in the last couple of years or the last couple of weeks. The first one is the Putin shock. I think Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and its exposure of its strategic goals for Europe we live in a new time since 2022. The second one is the Trump shock. I think even though we had seen Trump before and we sort of had listened to his statements, now as we see them actually being implemented and the harshness of the American rhetoric about Europe, the end of the transatlantic link, the US no longer an ally, perhaps even a competitor, a rival, that's a shock. And the last one, perhaps being the post-Western world shock. I think in the EU, when you look around, and yes, it's important to build alliances with partners, but how many are there out there? And aren't there quite a lot of countries from the global perspective who seem quite happy to go back to business as usual, or not to implement sanctions, or not to stand up for the values that the members of the EU are supposed to stand up for? So realization that we might be quite alone. And so given these three shocks, what are some of the measures and what can be done? I would like to emphasize four. The first one is money. I think Germany, and Sabine, happy for you to add even more to this, but Germany's bold recent financial moves under the incoming chancellor actually changes the economic landscape and does make concrete contributions to the EU's financial abilities and the European economy. The other part that has been mentioned that I will not go into depth with, but that's about confiscating the frozen Russian assets. The last one, shared EU borrowing for defense spending. And there's something that my country, Sweden, and its frugal positions is still quite reluctant. So some of the frugal states will need to change their positions when it comes to common borrowing. The second point is institutional change. Europe can step up. It has shown that in the past, the unthinkable can become thinkable when the EU is forced to by external pressure. I think moving to qualified majority voting in the CFSP, also moving to qualified majority voting in the intermediate steps of EU enlargement. There is nothing in the EU treaties that says that you need consensus for opening all the intermediate chapters. So there we can actually move ahead with speeding up the process. Then we need to have sober discussions on the meaning of Article 42.7. If we are serious about enlargement and see Ukraine as a future EU member, what does this mean without a NATO membership? What do the institutional provisions that we have agreed upon actually entail? And the third point is linked to some of the institutional remarks I made. It's actually delivering on enlargement. And I agree with you, Julia, that that's a long-term strategic vision, but it's also a short-term aspect in taking concrete steps as part of the accession processes, not only for Ukraine and Moldova, but also for the Western Balkans. This is of geopolitical urgency for the EU, not to lose the candidate states, not to lose the momentum in the enlargement process. And for it to be credible, it cannot only be abstract promises for the future. It needs to be concrete steps in the here and now. I think when it comes to Ukraine, immediately integrating Ukraine into the common foreign and security policy in the institutional frameworks, being part of the decision-making procedures, that could be something that is for the benefit of Ukraine and for the abilities of the EU. And speaking of abilities of the EU, that's my last point. And that's really stepping up on the common defense capabilities. Just money is not enough. It's also about how those resources are used. And there in Europe, we as of now don't have the institutional structures for leadership, mobility, command and control. Those are things we have done within NATO. So now we have to have clear discussions about what could a European pillar of NATO look like? What are the different capabilities that are used to complement each other? What kind of trilateral dialogues can we have to improve force mobility across Europe? So some really concrete military capabilities that need to be discussed. I think the threat perception that has been brought up has traditionally differed across Europe. But what I sense in Europe, given these three shocks, there is emerging a sense of urgency and also of commonality that the threat from Russia and its strategic long-term goals for Europe cannot be contained to Ukraine's territory. It's an existential threat to all of Europe. And I think finally, going back to your remarks, Oleksandr, I think it's key that Putin believes that time is on his side. And even though there's some kind of deal now, a break in the hostilities, that's not a long-term peace. The risk for renewed Russian aggression is imminent. And so all these steps that I have explicated and that have been discussed by my other fellow panelists, these will be necessary regardless. I think we are only in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Klara. We have like 15 minutes left, so I want to immediately open the floor to questions from the audience. Oh, I see we have a lot. So we'll take them in groups. Start with you, sir. If you can say who you are, where you're from, and if who you would like the question to be answered by would be helpful.
Thank you very much. My name is Nazar Babitsky. I represent the Ukrainian agricultural sector in Europe, but I think this is the systemic question that is of relevance to any sector and any, let's say, approach. My question is actually to all panelists, but I think I have been very much inspired by a very prescient analysis of the clear and present danger that was delivered by Sabine Fischer. But my questions are basically to all panelists, and I would try to formulate them in three of them. First, would you agree with the notion that, in fact, while I'm sure that almost all European capitals share your analysis of the situation as it unfolds, but in their response, the European states can be roughly divided into two very unequal camps. One of those camps are those states that still seek to accommodate individually to Trump policies and Trump demands as much as it takes, while another part of states cannot do that for the reason that the course Trump administration pursues is fundamentally at odds with their own core national security interests, so they cannot follow the former camp. Would you also agree with the notion that, in fact, Europe's backing of the suggestion of unconditional ceasefire followed by peace talks is actually a very painful compromise between these two camps of states, but it doesn't resolve the problem that the ceasefire as pushed by the US administration doesn't really resolve fundamental lack of security for Europe. And in that sense, and also another very painful requirement for Europe, that Europe is not at the negotiating table for the question that really touches the core nerve of Europe's security. And my third question is that in this regard, if you agree with these statements, I think you already heard from distinguished panelists various recipes and various responses that has been forthcoming from different European capitals and from Brussels. But in your opinion, what is missing to strengthen Europe's hand in this very disturbing unequal equation to make sure that Europe comes as a third strong part of this triangle? And what is missing in these very different approaches? Thank you.
Yes. Good morning. I'm Florentin Collomb. I'm correspondent for Le Figaro, French newspaper here in Brussels. Klara, you've touched on it a little bit about the question of EU accession. How do you think, not particularly you because you've talked about it, but other panelists, how do you see this topic weighing on in parallel to the peace negotiations that are taking place? And how do you see can be addressed the discrepancy between the warm words of EU officials saying that negotiations should be sped up, accession should be accelerated before 2030, maybe, said Ursula von der Leyen the other day, and the institutional gridlock in which we are when Hungary is blocking any opening of any negotiation cluster. And in parallel to that question as well, the strategy of the EU to make Ukraine a sort of steel porcupine, so arming it, improving its defense, and making it the first line of defense of any EU defense architecture. How does that take place in the negotiations where we see that on the other side, Putin and maybe Trump are asking that Ukraine should be disarmed, so to speak? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Yulia Bedenko from Kharkiv National University, and currently I'm with Carnegie Europe. I would like to address my question to Oleksandr and the other one very brief to our brilliant female speakers. So, Mr. Sushko, you're representative of one of the oldest but not of the largest donors operating in Ukraine. So my question is, how would you assess the ability of Ukrainian civil society to make input in, let's say, transparency, reforms, and control of the government being abandoned by the United States here? And referring Klara's, I would say, expression about the Putin shock, I wouldn't even ask why first Chechen war and second Chechen war or invasion in Georgia or annexation in Crimea haven't been this shock from Putin and even wake-up call. But I would like to ask you all about the potential Trump shock. So do we have here in Brussels clear visions how to address potential shock from Mr. Trump if this transatlantic, I would say, autonomy will turn into real, hostilities, or are there some red lines or policies on the table to discuss? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll come back to the speakers now. Maybe start with you in Sabine. And I'll ask you to all be quite brief, quite short in your answers, because I saw there's a lot of other questions on the floor.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. On the first question, which I think was more like a comment and an excellent comment, so I basically agree with what you said. What is missing? I think everything that, or not everything, but much of what was said on the panel, the actions that Europe has to take. And I mean, what is missing, in my view, most of all, is speed. That's our big problem, because we're always, and that's actually also an answer to your question, we have this conflict between geopolitical logic, and here we have unprecedented urgency, and bureaucratic logic, which is very much ingrained in European institutions and also in the interaction between member states. And we have not overcome that problem. So I would be very interested to hear from other speakers how they think the European Union can actually overcome that problem. And to your question on the Trump shock, I had an answer, but to be honest, I forgot what I wanted to say. So I let other speakers go first and then maybe come back if I remember. Sorry.
We'll take just, thank you for your comments and the questions, and I will take your question on the Ukrainian civil society versus Trump's shock. Yeah, this withdrawal of American support, which is, yeah, it's true that Ukrainian, so the US support to the civil society of Ukraine was quite significant for years, and it even increased during the full-scale war. So it was quite big amount of support in various forms, from the very grassroots, on the survival of local communities affected by the war, to the very high-level think tanks activity of those who do the policies on the national level. So this is, the impact is quite significant. And this is a challenge because it was rapid. So as everything which we see with Trump, it's really fast and rapid, and no one was prepared, which means that probably the understanding and the contingency planning of the many actors was not good enough not to be prepared. So what was disclosed that, for example, some civil society organizations were dependent on American funds by 90%, for example, by 80%. So on one hand, there is a clear disruptive effect of the withdrawal of US. On the other hand, there is also indication of the lack of strategic planning on the side of civil society organizations to allow such a level of dependency on one source. There's not so many of them, but there are some. And I think that this is a situation which can bring lessons to be learned by many, to see that, first of all, there should be more, I would say, wise fundraising policy, which should not make civil society so dependent from one source. And I think that despite the disruptive effect, we also may see some positive effect also. So there will be, and I already indicate this, talking to many civil society organizations in our country, that they becoming more serious about diversification of their strategy on fundraising. They becoming more serious regarding the planning, not relying on one source only. They becoming more serious about talking to their own people, to the Ukrainian actors who can provide some financial support, including private foundation, but also ordinary people. So this is a chance for many to think about the direct talk to people, to fundraise from them. So it depends on many circumstances, but there is. So for civil society, it's a shock, but not the shock which will erase the civil society. It's not the tragedy, but it's drama. To some extent, it will be evident decrease of certain activities. But at the same time, we have learned from our communication, there are some polling data available now from the polling those who were clients of the US support, that only just about 15% of those who were polled, who were recipients, they say that they will abandon certain fields of activity, only 15%, which is not so much. So the others will try to apply alternative strategies of survival. Maybe some of them will need to cut their stuff, to cut some plans, but they are unlikely to withdraw from their core activities. And so this is also the chance for the European Union to reconsider, to increase, pay more attention, and we already have signs of this change, as for example, just a couple of days ago, the EU announced that the EU will increase support for Ukraine independent media, committing 10 million euro just for the independent media for this year. So these are some. So this is not an easy question, but there are some attempts to respond seriously, and so generally, I'm rather optimistic on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleksandr. Then we had the question about the EU accession and in parallel to the peace process and whether Hungary will be a blockade, as well as the question related to arming Ukraine like a steel hedgehog. So maybe I can put these two to you, Julia and Klara, and then I'll take another round of questions. I mean, we may go over the time limit by a few minutes, but I think that'd be okay. So.
I'll reflect really briefly on the EU negotiation training. I'll be in Kiev next week, working with the Ukraine delegation on the internal market cluster. And yeah, with regard to these discrepancies, there is Hungary that is now in a way of opening the first cluster of negotiations. And if you look from the history, we see that Hungary, the objective of Viktor Orban usually is to get something out of it, right? So that's the question: what will he get, and whether the agreement can be made that this is really the last time that this is happening. I know this is not easy. On the other side, Ukrainian government is very ambitious, also realistic, or at least I think they base their ambitions on the realistic expectations, but they are planning to at least to have a good planning and to implement the necessary legislation on all clusters by the end of 2026, and then start implementation after that. So adding to the message of Oleksandr about taking responsibility on both sides, and Ukraine is really doing their best to do their homework on EU accession, but it also helps if this progress is visible. It also helps to persuade some of the skeptical EU members that are, such as Netherlands, for example, that are very much focusing on a strict and fair accession rules and objectives. And then there was a question on air defense. I will leave it to you, Klara, otherwise I'm talking too much.
Well, I'll make three remarks related to the questions asked. Whether there was a readiness in the EU to the Trump shock? No, I don't think so. And I just agree with you also 100% in terms of why does it always come so late? But in a way, that's what we have. An EU that is not so good at being proactive or realizing the shocks well in time, but it can be reactive and get its act together when it really has to. That can give me a sense of hope, sometimes at least. Second, I agree with you, Sabine, on speed being a key element that is missing. I think some of the ways of getting that necessary speed will, one, be to work in more formats for coalitions of the willing. The Nordic-Baltic cooperation, I think, can be taken as a model and how that can be expanded to include other countries as well. Another one will really be to keep insisting on qualified majority voting, even though it's not a new issue. But if we have enough external pressure, enough external shocks, it can happen. So we should keep insisting on it. The last point for speed will be political leadership and resolve. It's the individuals leading their respective member states, but also them to feel that they are backed up by their citizens. So that's where we come in and where the public comes in, different NGOs and think tanks. Finally, I would like to just briefly follow up on your point on the institutional gridlock and Hungary blocking the the opening of the first cluster for Ukraine. I think this is a major problem that we actually need to discuss in an open and sober way. And the fact that Hungary is actively working against the EU's not only core and founding values, but its core interests. And what are then the institutional mechanisms that we have to deal with this? There are some provisions in the treaties. What would an Article 7 procedure against Hungary look like? Even though there's not a concrete discussion on the table, it's something that we in these formats can discuss, and also looking at other institutional provisions.
Hi, absolutely. Thank you. Jack Power from the Irish Times. Just a very quick question on how, maybe to Sabine, on how you see, or Klara, how you see the geographical divide playing out, where states like Ireland, Spain, Portugal, the war in Ukraine can seem very far away. And how do you think that will impact things going forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helga Schmidt. I'm working as a correspondent for ARD, German TV and radio. I would like to come back to Sabine Fischer's remark concerning the Munich Security Conference and what J.D. Vance said. You said it might have been a turning point, kind of change. What change do you see when it comes to France, Italy, and Spain? Because last summit, last council on Saturday, those three countries showed no interest. They said they would never get loans from the rearm program because it's loans. Also, these countries, when it comes to military support, they gave less than the Netherlands alone, than Denmark alone. So where do you see any change? And what does that mean for the leader of the coalition of the willing? You talked about a lot about there's much hope in that coalition of the willing. The leader seems to be the French president. He seems not to be willing to pay 3 or 4 billion this year, and it's all about speed. You emphasize that, and I think that's really important. What now comes as military support to Ukraine in this year. Yeah, I think Germany it's clear that Germany has to pay a large amount, but it's also clear that Germany cannot pay it alone. So what is your proposition? Thank you.
Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. Thank you for the floor. Excellent presentations, a lot of comments, but I limit myself to questions. Sabine, we have had the US position trying to facilitate for Russians to come out of the sanctions. But most of these sanctions are European ones, including SWIFT and agricultural products. So what you expect will be the reaction of the EU on that regard? Klara, if I may, to follow up my colleague from Figaro, tomorrow we'll have a coalition of willing in Paris in supporting Ukraine. Do you expect that that kind of meeting could grow in something more, like in the future structure of the European security, especially if we consider that the NATO between us is dead now? And to Oleksandr, now we have two parties, Russia and US, from both sides pushing Ukraine to break the door, negotiation door. My question is, from your perspective, how long will Ukrainian authorities keep patient not to close that door finally? Thank you.
Well, in response to your very concrete question, I think, yes, in a way, what we are seeing taking shape is a future structure for European security cooperation. And if you even go back to the treaties and the common security and defense policy is said to have as the end goal a common European defense if European member states so agree. So we have the institutional provisions. But then I think it's important to emphasize that we also need to work with and within NATO, because we do have some concrete key capabilities that are now at NATO level and within NATO structures. So I don't think it's either or. We have to work with all the formats we have.
Yes, yeah, to add to that, what we are seeing now is last 3 years, but especially this year, is a significant change in the public opinion within the European Union when it comes to urgent security threats, when it comes of perception of Russia as a threat, and the support for a joint European army, for example, or greater defense spending. And this is a really important element, because this is, we have been talking, there was a lot of talk, right, because of the challenge to actually the political commitments or promises that are done, how to implement them. The same goes for the meeting, ongoing series of meetings in Paris and in other countries with the coalition of the willing, with their plan that they are preparing to put on the table for Trump on the security guarantees for Ukraine, how to make it done. And this change in opinion, in public opinion, following the shocks that were described earlier, is a really significant element to make it actually operational. That's, yeah, that and a second, yeah, I think I will stop here because I already lost the train of thought. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, the political decision has been taken by Ukrainian government to take part in this negotiation. So this is very important to demonstrate the acceptance of the very idea of talks. And also, Ukrainian side also had the lessons from the recent cases, such as the incident in the Oval Office on February 28. And as far as I understand, the lessons were learned. On one hand, Zelensky continued to focus on the issues of dignity, as he said. And he says that if the dignity is challenged, Ukraine would resist. And I think that this is how they formulate the issue of the limits of passion. Yeah. On the other hand, there is a understanding that Ukraine needs to be there. Even if these negotiations are not designed in a way how Ukraine would like to design this negotiation, anyway, there will be participation, and there will be possible the quite careful approach, not to be blamed on the disruption or the collapse of negotiations. So there will be very careful approach to take part and to agree on. So on one hand, there is a need to stress on the red lines. On the other hand, all which is beyond the red lines, okay, it can be negotiated. So I think that, again, lessons to be learned. There should not be nervous such reactions any longer. But again, dignity is an issue. So I think that this is a limit, which I say. So the issue how long, it's difficult to me to say, because Ukraine, certainly the time is pressing to some extent, but it is even more pressing for Trump, because Trump is a hostage of his time frame. He is in urgency and this urgency was self-imposed. So he was to impose, he said that we need a fast peace. And if you are in a hurry, and the other side, Russia is not in a hurry. So this is something, again, which weakens Trump's position. Ukraine here is not pressing, neither to hurry or to delay as Russia do. So I think that at least for the most recent days of negotiations, I think that the approach is quite pragmatic on the Ukrainian side. So I expect it to continue this way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent questions. I start with your question, Herr Schmidt. So I think there will be there are tough negotiations ahead. And I mean, I cannot predict what the outcome will be. I only hope that, you know, when Germany is at the end of this very painful transition in this very painful geopolitical situation, that the next German government will play a productive role in these negotiations about the sort of implementation of the plans that are being developed now at the European level. I wanted to make one remark about the coalitions of the willing, because I think indeed they are very important, especially because now we have to move fast. But of course, there are also problems coming with them. So internal problems, because of course, they create a Europe of very different speeds, and we will have to deal with this, with the unevenness that this creates inside Europe. And I think they also generate a communication problem in Europe's external relations, because it is very difficult to explain, again, how Europe operates in this situation when you have, on the one hand, the European institutions, and on the other hand, several coalitions of the willing that are doing different things. So I'm not sort of speaking against coalitions of the willing, but I think these are problems that we need to reckon with and that we need to deal with. I think what I just said also speaks a little bit to your question about the geographical divide, but there's one point that I would like to make, because indeed we still have varying threat perceptions across Europe when it comes to Russia. And I think what hasn't sunk in sufficiently in European Union member states that are a little bit further away from Ukraine, but also in my own member states, if I look at segments of German society, is the hybrid threat, the hybrid warfare that Russia is actually waging against all European democracies. And this is something, I mean, you know, I think we need a very serious strategic debate across Europe exactly about this hybrid warfare and the systemic war that Russia is waging, not only against Ukraine, but indeed also against European democracies. We don't have that debate yet. We don't have it in a sufficient form, and we don't have a sufficient sense of urgency and sense of necessity to strengthen the resilience of European societies against this threat. Very briefly on sanctions, it is true that most sanctions are on the European side, but of course the American sanctions, the secondary sanctions, the financial sanctions play an extremely important role, specifically also with regard to the implementation of the European sanctions. So if the US walks away from the sanctions regime, we will have a problem. That doesn't mean that we cannot do anything. So yes, I think Europe needs to expand sanctions. I think there's a lot that can still be done with regard to oil prices, sanctioning, shadow fleet, etc. And of course, and I think this was mentioned already, I think by you, we need to have a serious conversation about Russian frozen assets now, because these concerns about this reflecting badly on the investment climate and the perception of Europe as a place for investment in other parts of the world, I think we have moved beyond that. So we need to have a serious conversation about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. I now have to close the meeting. Apologies for running over that by nearly 15 minutes, but I think it was worth it. I think we had a wonderful discussion, and thanks from all the excellent insights of all of the speakers. Thank you for joining us. Do you want to say a few closing words, Hennadiy? Okay. Okay, well, thanks to all of you guys for coming as well. Please keep an eye on the EPC's website for upcoming events related to Ukraine and other regional issues. So thanks again to all of you.